Kiki, reduce that thing, please. Guys, please let us like and subscribe. Thank you. Hi, Mira. How are you, dear? Hello, Popu. Hi, guys. Hope you're good. Hi, Sadia. Guys, if you're just coming in, please let's like and subscribe. Thank you. You look pretty. Thank you so much, dear. Thank you so much. Yeah, guys, you're welcome. Please let's go like and subscribe. Thank you. Do you know Stray Kids? Yes, I do. I look like them, right? Hi, please drop your name. Let me give you a shout out. Kelly, you're so pretty. Have a wonder. Please subscribe, guys. Drop your name. I gave you a yeah, guys, please let's go like and subscribe. Thank you so much. I have a dentist appointment today. Oh, I hope it goes well. My name is Maimora. Hi. A big shout out to Maimora. Sorry, Maimona. I beg your pardon. Hello. A big shout out to Gihulwa. A big shout out to Mia. Guys, let's go. Let's go subscribe. A big shout out to Zena. A big shout out to Marcy. A big shout out to Lena. A big shout out to Kiki. A big shout out to Anissa. A big shout out to Anis. A big shout out to Taylor. A big shout out to Antom. A big shout out to Sienna. A big shout out to Priestley. A big shout out to Montio. A big shout out to Ima. Shout out to Ziwa. Shout out to Storm. Shout out to Junior. Hello, love you. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Eric. Guys, please let's like and sub. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Demby. Guys, let's go like and sub. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Savi. Let's go, guys. Please let's go like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Guys, let's go like and sub. Thank you. A big shout out to Amina. A big shout out to Safa. Oh, this bead is falling off. A big shout out to Logie. Guys, let's go like and subscribe. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Shampati. Let's go, guys. You're beautiful. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Simona. Guys, can we take the likes up? Thank you so much. Let's take the like to 20. Let's go. A big shout out to Anna. A big shout out to Lena. A big shout out to Kim. A big shout out to Hola. A big shout out to Zion. A big shout out to Charlie. A big shout out to India. A big shout out to Kristen. A big shout out to Elena. A big shout out to Celine. A big shout out to Diva. Hi, Diva. I thought that was your name. A big shout out to Minis. A big shout out to Nicholas. A big shout out to Dakota. Yay. A big shout out to Mangi. A big shout out to Hava. A big shout out to David. Guys, let's go. Let's go, guys. Big shout out to Isla. Big shout out to Irene. A big shout out to Mike Honk. Lovely. Pretty names. A big shout out to Leona. A big shout out to Zinigia. Let's go. A big shout out to Benito. Let's go. A big shout out to Lexi. A big shout out to Leslie. Guys, let's go. Like, my hair is cool. Thank you so much. I love you too, darling. I love you. Guys, let's go like and subscribe. A big shout out to Randy. Yeah, a big shout out to Shinobu. A big shout out to Holly. A big shout out to Kiki. Let's go, guys. Big shout out to Alicia. Clark Kate. Thank you for liking. Can we take the like to 20? Yeah, guys, let's subscribe. A big shout out to Hava. A big shout out to Chloe. A big shout out to Vivan. A big shout out to Wesam. A big shout out to Poppy. A big shout out to Rayleigh. A big shout out to Sophie. Thank you for subscribing. A big shout out to Leslie. A big shout out to Juan Chilokinas. A big shout out to I subscribe. Thank you for subbing. A big shout out to Daily. A big shout out to Holly. A big shout out to Armani. A big shout out to Imogen. A big shout out to Wisdom Ovi. A big shout out to Ruby. Guys, let's go. Let's go. Let's go. A big shout out to Tatozo. Oh no. A big shout out to Valentina. A big shout out to Jay. A big shout out to Betsy. A big shout out to Ava. A big shout out to Eastin. A big shout out to Adamanti. A big shout out to Onthatai. A big shout out to Kaylani. Let's go. A big shout out to Marvin. A big shout out to Abogos. A big shout out to Lena. A big shout out to Kenetatoto. A big shout out to Celo. Are you Marcelo? A big shout out to Alessia. A big shout out to Romy. A big shout out to Jaden. A big shout out to Noah. I remember you, Abogos. A big shout out to Helen. A big shout out to Isa. A big shout out to Lani. A big shout out to Ariana Popo. A big shout out to Matthios. A big shout out to Hesse. Let's go, guys. A big shout out to Kelly. A big shout out to Mosina. A big shout out to Hesse. Let's go, guys. Please, let's drop our names. Let's go, go. A big shout out to Harvey. A big shout out to Ima. Yes, I remember you. A big shout out to Haley. Big shout out to Mia. Big shout out to Olivia. Big shout out to Mikael. A big shout out to Reem. Let's go. A big shout out to Lucad. Let's go, guys. Let's go. A big shout out to Winnie. Winnie. A big shout out to our back. A big shout out to Evie. A big shout out to Mano. Let's go. A big shout out to Embaline. A big shout out to Lucas. A big shout out to Gaia. Let's go, guys. Let's go, 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 go. A big shout out to Kelanin. A big shout out to Athena. A big shout out to Celine. A big shout out to Zoe. A big shout out to Sasko. A big shout out to Adrel. A big shout out to Ima. A big shout out to Leah. A big shout out to Han. A big shout out to Raulio. A big shout out to Melika. A big shout out to Katharina. A big shout out to Storm. Guys, please let's go like and subscribe. Let's go, let's go. Let's take 10 seconds to like and subscribe. Thank you. You're pretty. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Lima. A big shout out to Swan. You're gorgeous. Thank you. A big shout out to let's go. Clock it, girl. Like oh, thank you so much. A big shout out to Julie. A big shout out to Tati. Let's go. Clock it, Maya. Okay. A big shout out to Madia. A big shout out to Emma. Yeah, let's go. A big shout out to Luke. Gorgeous name. A big shout out to Madina. A big shout out to Alexia. You're beautiful. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Adi. A big shout out to Luke. Love you too. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Samira. A big shout out to Hima. Hi, Poppy. Big shout out to Poppy. Big shout out to Samira. Let's go. I love your hair. So beautiful. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Joanna. Oh, Maya, I miss you too. A big shout out to Camila. A big shout out to Shandi. Oh my God, you're so pretty. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Zoe. Do you like K-pop? Yes. A big shout out to Batalomat. A big shout out to Naomi. A big shout out to Zoe. I think it's all done now. Yeah. Yeah, let's go, guys. Let's go. A big shout out to Yaris. A big shout out to Han. Thank you. I'm done with my bead now. A big shout out to Hallis. A big shout out to Coco Melon. I hope that's your name. A big shout out to Kamora. Yay. What's your favorite song? Your hair is beautiful. Thank you so much. Do I have favorite song? I love many songs, so I don't really have favorite. A big shout out to Rebecca. Let's go, guys. Put down your name. I'll give you a shout. Let's go. Clock it. A big shout out to Becca. A big shout out to Andrew. A big shout out to a big shout out to me. Yeah. Thank you. Somebody said a big shout out to you. Yeah, that's me. A big shout out to Nafisat. A big shout out to Andrew. A big shout out to Shadeen. Let's go, guys. That just dropped. Yeah, a big shout out to Georgia. A big shout out to Ria. A big shout out to Nisona. A big shout out to Hellis. A big shout out to Tristan. A big shout out to Harry. A big shout out to Sana. A big shout out to Habia. A big shout out to Dakota. A big shout out to Vakolisa. Hello, lovelies. Hi, gorgeous. Slay Queen and Prince. Queen and Kings. A big shout out to Jory. A big shout out to Sonak Chi. A big shout out to Abibs. A big shout out to Ines. A big shout out to Will. Shout out to Samira. Shout out to Romania. Shout out to Hannah. Shout out to Hallis. Shout out to Zoe. Shout out to Becca. Shout out to Lisa. Shout out to Vecna. Shout out to Maddie. Shout out to Etinosa. My Bini sister or brother, because Etinosa, a man and a woman can literally bear that name. So shout out to you, my Bini. I'm also from Benin. A big shout out to Arena. A big shout out to Gojo. A big shout out to Elijah. A big shout out to Zoe. Kiki, I want to know what means the word yes. A big shout out to Romania. A big shout out to Williams. A big shout out to Kiki Healy. A big shout out to Sanaya. Clock Kids. A big shout out to Zoe. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Tommy. A big shout out to Mike. A big shout out to Jisoo. A big shout out to Lucas. Yeah. A big shout out to Tommy. What's about a big shout out to Amira? A big shout out to Stephanie. I know you people prefer the tiny voice, right? Do you prefer the stretching parts, or you just want me to just say it like that? A big shout out to Lohana. A big shout out to Kiki. Yeah, that's me. That's me. That's me. Clock it. A big shout out to Steven. A big shout out to Amina. A big shout out to Jax. A big shout out to Kia. A big shout out to Anaya. A big shout out to Mark Calista. A big shout out to Leon. A big shout out to Joy. A big shout out to Ines. A big shout out to Amber. A big shout out to Kingsley. Yeah. A big shout out to Mookie. A big shout out to Natalie. A big shout out to Mark Hunt. A big shout out to Gabriella. A big shout out to Mike. A big shout out to... Don't tell me Didi, please. No. A big shout out to Ethan. I beg your pardon. A big shout out to Lena. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Michaela. A big shout out to Mary. A big shout out to Mia. A big shout out to Lana Bana. A big shout out to Ada. A big shout out to Poppy. Thank you so much, guys. Guys, thank you for liking and subscribing. Please, can we take the likes up to 40? Thank you so much, gorgeous. A big shout out to Lauren. You look pretty. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Orpheus. You sub. Thank you for subbing. Thank you so much for subbing. A big shout out to Carla. A big shout out to Blessing. We are all blessed. Amen. A big shout out to ADC. A big shout out to Chessie. A big shout out to Mitchell. A big shout out to Lauren. A big shout out to Alita. A big shout out to Hexin. Your hair is cute. Thank you so much. Thank you. A big shout out to King. Clock it. Yeah, let's go. You're beautiful. Thank you so much. You're gorgeous as well. You all have pretty names, honestly, and I'm so happy to call them. You all are, your names are literally pretty, as in beautiful names. Okay, Kiki, can we ask you questions. Please later, not now. We're just giving a quick shout out. It will be later, sorry, later at the end of the live stream, okay? I'll take questions. Please, apologies. A big shout out to Luna. Oh, you're welcome, Clark It. A big shout out to Azel. A big shout out to Sophia. A big shout out to Brooklyn. I sub. Hello. Hello, Gigi. A big shout out to Gigi. Thanks for subbing, guys. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Grace. A big shout out to Sophia. A big shout out to Lauren. Do you remember me? Yes, I do. Please put down your name. A big shout out to Kay. A big shout out to Abby. A big shout out to Eliana. So, guys, can I squeeze 1 minute of your time? Just 1 minute. I just want to take something. I just want to get something. Just 1 minute, please. Okay, it might be lesser than that. Please, just 1 minute. Stay tuned. I just want to quickly get something. I'll be back. Is that okay? Stop threatening her to leave for your name. Yeah, please, guys, please be patient. Calm down. Okay? Just 1 minute, guys. Please, I beg of you. I'll be back. Clock it. 1 minute. I'm rushing down. Oh, thank you so much, my darlings. I'm back. Yeah. Hearts the chat. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Oh, you all are amazing. Oh my God. A big shout out to Ruben. They can't sing. Who can't sing? A big shout out to Jessica. Guys, let's go like and subscribe. I'm panting now. A big shout out to Connie. You're pretty. Thank you so much. You're gorgeous as well. Trust me. A big shout out to Kaylee. Your hair is amazing. Thank you. A big shout out to Daisy. A big shout out to Ima. A big shout out to Lara. A big shout out to Nimra. A big shout out to Brooklyn. A big shout out to Stella. A big shout out to Guyana. A big shout out to Emilia. Clock it. A big shout out to Kathy. A big shout out to Diamond. You love my hair? Oh, thank you guys. You all are amazing. Thank you so much. Please let's go like and subscribe. And don't forget to always watch my videos. Yeah. Please drop your comments. Let me know you saw it and your likes. Thank you. A big shout out to Lassie. A big shout out to Lara. You're beautiful. Thank you so much, Cece. You're pretty. Thank you so much, my lovelies. Thank you. A big shout out to Ohema. A big shout out to Ollie. I love your shirt. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Thank you. The love is massive. And I love you all too. I love you too. Thank you. A big shout out to Mia. A big shout out to Lola. A big shout out to Yankons. Icons. I think that's the right pronunciation. A big shout out to Matcha. A big shout out to Jackson. A big shout out to Kiki. I like your shirt. Thank you so much. What's the matter? Somebody is saying remove scent. Yeah, what's the matter? What's going on? What has happened? Please, guys, let's stay positive. I don't want to see any negative comment. That is how I will remove you. Please, please, I've not seen sent comments, but please just let's be calm. When I see his comment is not okay, I'm going to take him away. So please, please, let's be calm. But I've known Saint for some time now. I don't know him to be like that. I don't know what he has done. But please, Saint, please be guided. Please be guided. It's my channel. Is this channel, you know? You've been here for ages, and please, I don't want to ruin this day. Please, let's just stay calm. Just drop your name. Let me give you a shout out, please. A big shout out to Ona. A big shout out to Olive. A big shout out to Jama. A big shout out to Dorichi. Oh, how do you talk English? I managed to speak English, honestly, so I'm not perfect at all. I commit blunders as well. Is bent racist, really? Okay, I'll watch out for him. Just relax. A big shout out to Natty. A big shout out to PC. I've not even seen his comments, funny enough, so I can't even, locate him. But don't worry, just relax. I'll find it. A big shout out to Essie. A big shout out to Lena. A big shout out to Fassi. A big shout out to Saga. Yeah, guys, we shouldn't be distracted, okay? Let's just do this. Don't be distracted. Don't worry. Just leave him for me. A big shout out to Rockwell. A big shout out to Ma Jaman. A big shout out to Charlie. A big shout out to Nina. A big shout out to Fire. A big shout out to Kason. A big shout out to Emily. A big shout out to Melissa. Guys, please let's take the like up to 70. Please let's take the likes up to 70. And also subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Anthony. A big shout out to Ruth. A big shout out to Jessica. A big shout out to Ruth. A big shout out to Eliana. A big shout out to Letro. A big shout out to Aubrey. A big shout out to Jamali. A big shout out to Emma. A big shout out to Mick. You're the best. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Jasmine. A big shout out to Lehana. A big shout out to Haley and Lily. You love my hair. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Penny. A big shout out to Livy. Hi, Onyx. A big shout out to Onyx. Yeah, guys, if you have any question for me, let me just reiterate this. Please, if you have any question for me, can you please wait till the end of the live? I will give like 10 to 5 minutes for questions and answers. But now is just shout out. Yeah, just shout out. So drop your names. I will get back to your questions at the end. A big shout out to Oshama. A big shout out to Adi. A big shout out to Luke. A big shout out to Elliot. A big shout out to Jaden. A big shout out to Manon. A big shout out to Aisha. A big shout out to Katerina. A big shout out to Kali. A big shout out to Aisha. A big shout out to Plaki. A big shout out to Vanessa. A big shout out to Ruben. Guys, let's go subscribe and like. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Mia. A big shout out to Lily. A big shout out to Otis. A big shout out to Sharon. A big shout out to Queenie. A big shout out to Helsa. A big shout out to Mira. A big shout out to Akrina. A big shout out to Annabelle. A big shout out to Gonasia. A big shout out to Skylar. A big shout out to 11. A big shout out to Sakid. A big shout out to List. A big shout out to Abigail. A big shout out to Chloe. A big shout out to Asa. A big shout out to Liat. A big shout out to Ella. A big shout out to Angel Doobie. Thank you so much. Guys, please let's go subscribe. Can we take the likes up to 90 for me, please? Thank you. A big shout out to Taylor. A big shout out to Kiki. A big shout out to Sarah. A big shout out to Blackly. A big shout out to Nora. A big shout out to Yunche. Seth. If I see your comment and yeah, it's not what this channel is all about, I will take you down, please. Please, let's be guided. A big shout out to Tonderia. A big shout out to Lily. A big shout out to Queen Sana. A big shout out to Theodore. A big shout out to Paul. A big shout out to Lila. A big shout out to Dareb. A big shout out to Mina. A big shout out to Ollie. Shout out to Eric. Shout out to Darrell. A big shout out to Dion. A big shout out to Humaria. A big shout out to Team. A big shout out to Fida. A big shout out to One Wohanda. A big shout out to Lara Rage from India. Nice to meet you. A big shout out to Carolina. A big shout out to Zuwanda. A big shout out to Ima. A big shout out to Amiva from UK. Hi. A big shout out to Zaylee. A big shout out to Seth. Why do you say I should remove Lara? Please, let's drop our names. Yeah, Seth, what's the matter? Yeah, I don't want any. Please don't go after yourself. Come after me. Yeah, because I created the channel. So come after me. Leave yourself alone on the comment section. No one should talk anything bad about yourself on the comment section. Just come after me. Yeah, I'm here. Okay? I'm okay. Yeah, just come. So please, let's be guided. If you don't want me to take you off, I beg you. I'm begging you. Please. Please. A big shout out to... no worries, Maya. A big shout out to Bella. A big shout out to Fa. Yeah, I understand, Maya, but just leave it for me, okay? Don't worry. I'm watching and I'm seeing your comments. I'm just trying to be very, very vigilant. So once I see your comments, no forgiveness. You know, I used to forgive, but this one, no forgiveness, because it is distracting me. Yeah, honestly, it is distracting me. Okay. A big shout out to Amanda. A big shout out to Faha. A big shout out to Tio. A big shout out to Faha. A big shout out to Pristine. A big shout out to Mia. A big shout out to Iman. A big shout out to Team. A big shout out to Willow. Welcome back. Drop your names. A big shout out to Ovalt. A big shout out to Monica. Why is your voice so... Okay, now I've seen it. Yeah, he said, why is your voice so annoying? Okay, so I need to take you down. Thank you so much for coming. Try your luck later. Bye, Seth. All done. So, yeah, I've seen it, Maya. So I've taken him off here. So he's no longer with us. Now we can have peace. A big shout out to Emily. A big Clockies. A big shout out to Avi. A big shout out to Team. I'm not bad. Am I bad? I begged him. I said, please, I don't want that. But it kept, I just saw it. So I just have to take him off. So I'm not bad. I try to, beg him, but he won't still have it. So there's nothing I can do. Away, 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 far away. We don't want, far away. Move away, far, 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 far. All right, let's go, guys. Let's dive into it. A big shout out to Sarah. Your voice is beautiful. Thank you so much, Maya. I'll pin that for you. A big shout out to Ima, my bestie, Sarah. A big shout out to Monica. Is it Momina? I think I saw Monina. A big shout out to Team. So I need to be focused now because those comments were just coming and it is distracting me. Guys, please just put your name down. Let me give you a shout out. A big shout out to Felix. A big shout out to T. Yeah, I love you too. A big shout out to Massin. A big shout out to Ariana Miku. A big shout out to Wanda. A big shout out to Copper. A big shout out to Hella. A big shout out to, oh, I love you too. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Sky. A big shout out to Steven. A big shout out to Ambogus. A big shout out to Navali. A big shout out to Maya. A big shout out to Kathleen. A big shout out to Aliana. You're not trash. What's that? Come on, drop your name. Let me give you a shout out. And stop swearing at yourself. You're good. You're great. You're better. You're best. So drop your name. Let me give you a shout out, okay? A big shout out to Camila. Clock it, Maya. You're amazing. Thank you for that. A big shout out to Tracy. A big shout out to Eki, Eliza. A big shout out to Hayden. A big shout out to Ella. A big shout out to Adali. A big shout out to Demi. A big shout out to Abby. A big shout out to Rashim. A big shout out to eBay. A big shout out to Blake. A big shout out to Robin. A big shout out to Bessie. A big shout out to Theodore. A big shout out to Valentina. A big shout out to Diana. A big shout out to Trisha. Shout out to 11. A big shout out to Ima. A big shout out to Sabrina Carpenter. A big shout out to Straith. A big shout out to Zuki. A big shout out to Leela. A big shout out to Bobby. A big shout out to Isanel. A big shout out to Amber. A big shout out to Ollie. A big shout out to Jonathan. A big shout out to Will. A big shout out to Kayla. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Maliasa. I love your voice. Thank you so much. And you're so beautiful. Thank you so much. You're gorgeous as well. A big shout out to Jake. A big shout out to Usman. A big shout out to Lexi. A big shout out to Ava. A big shout out to Mike. A big shout out to Kaylee. A big shout out to Jasmine. A big shout out to Pelia. A big shout out to Dustin. A big shout out to Olo. A big shout out to Rome. A big shout out to Han. A big shout out to Max. A big shout out to Samara. A big shout out to Aisha. A big shout out to Theodore. A big shout out to Vecna. A big shout out to Opa. A big shout out to Unati. A big shout out to Sienna. A big shout out to A big shout out to Joycey. Guys, please, can we take the likes up to 90, please? Please. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Just for 10 seconds, not one. 10 seconds, please. Let's take the likes up and also subscribe. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's pop in. Let's go. Come on, come on, come on. A big shout out to Aliyah. A big shout out to Head. A big shout out to Subela. A big shout out to Hida. A big shout out to Nasi. A big shout out to Sophie. A big shout out to Rihanna. A big shout out to Lena. A big shout out to Caleb. A big shout out to Janissa. A big shout out to Hala. A big shout out to Lily. A big shout out to Easy. Guys, let's go like and sub. Thank you. A big shout out to Cass Half. A big shout out to Hala. Hala is good. A big shout out to Rachel. A big shout out to Zuki. A big shout out to Kataleya. A big shout out to Heda. A big shout out to Harsha. A big shout out to Tio. A big shout out to Imam. A big shout out to Dala. A big shout out to Aiza. A big shout out to Swalia. A big shout out to Zia. A big shout out to Aurora. A big shout out to Arif. A big shout out to Zaydin. A big shout out to Sia. A big shout out to Rosie. A big shout out to Rosa. A big shout out to Skyros. A big shout out to Yones. A big shout out to Amara. A big shout out to Sharaya. A big shout out to Dahum. A big shout out to Austin. A big shout out to Theodore Eric. A big shout out to Bana Banga. A big shout out to Mata. Thank you so much, guys, for liking and for subscribing. A big shout out to Darosa Lava. A big shout out to Ava. Do you know I love long names? As in, even if it's difficult for me to pronounce, but I just like it long. The way it sounds, you know. But anyways, clock it. A big shout out to Maha. A big shout out to Easy. A big shout out to Joseph. A big shout out to Rosalie. A big shout out to Aisha. A big shout out to Lizzie. A big shout out to Ria. A big shout out to Charlie's. A big shout out to Gabby. Hi. A big shout out to Gabby. Eat really fast. A big shout out to Haila. A big shout out to Shiluva. A big shout out to George. A big shout out to Banabonga. I remember you, darling. Hope you're good. A big shout out to Lebo. A big shout out to Sabia. A big shout out to Queen. A big shout out to Charlie's. A big shout out to Malisin. Charlotte. A big shout out to Kendra. A big shout out to my mom. Hi, Maddie. Big shout out to Maddie. A big shout out to Kendra. A big shout out to Arnav. A big shout out to Heather. A big shout out to Kenny Halabi. A big shout out to Ama. I love your hair. Thank you so much, guys. Please, let's go like and subscribe. Yeah, can we take just 10 seconds to like and sub? God bless you so much. God bless you. Let's go like and sub. Yeah, can we take the like up? Yeah, let's take the likes up. Let's take the likes up to, yeah, 1015. And let's subscribe. Thank you. Shout out to Leeds. A big shout out to Lead. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Deep. I love your braid. Oh, clock it. You are making me blush tonight. Oh my days. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Teddy Bears. A big shout out to Makelele. Where is I like your shirt and sweater, and my name is. A big shout out to Lavinia. Let's go. Let's go like and subscribe. Bana Banga, that's good. A big shout out to Idris. A big shout out to Ellie. Thank you so much. Excuse me. A big shout out to Betalafai. A big shout out to Louise Dali. A big shout out to Diana. A big shout out to Ocean. A big shout out to Mariam. A big shout out to Gabe Owners. A big shout out to Kelvin. A big shout out to Yaretzi. Thank you so much. You all are gorgeous. A big shout out to Ooh. A big shout out to Leon, all the way from Poland. Hi, Leon. Hope you're good. A big shout out to Dixon. A big shout out to Malaya. A big shout out to Demi. A big shout out to Oakley Wellman. A big shout out to Valentina. A big shout out to Paisley. A big shout out to Alice Warren. A big shout out to Akonaho. A big shout out to Sane. A big shout out to Evie. A big shout out to Fuhebi. Guys, please let's go like and sub. Can we take the likes up and let's sub? Thank you. Let's go just for 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, Just 10 seconds, guys. Please, let's go. Um, let's go subscribe. Thank you. 10 seconds. Let's go. Let's go, 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 go. A big shout out to Breathly. Yeah, please tell me how to say it. A big shout out to Fa. A big shout out to Nova. A big shout out to Suki. Thank you so much. Big shout out to Nope. Neptune, yeah. A big shout out to Fawad. A big shout out to Mia. A big shout out to Theo. I love your air and video. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Jessica. A big shout out to Norba. A big shout out to Maya. A big shout out to Bradley. A big shout out to Paisley Maruna Lilu. A big shout out to Olivia from Highland. A big shout out to Pranish. A big shout out to Harvey. A big shout out to Lelu. A big shout out to Fawad. Let's go. Please, let's like and subscribe. A big shout out to Nabaduda. I love you too. Thank you so much. I miss you. A big shout out to Sakura. A big shout out to Shadow. A big shout out to Alice. A big shout out to Tio Tio. A big shout out to Fabayela. A big shout out to Chantel. A big shout out to No. Let's go. Please, let's subscribe, guys. Let's subscribe. Big shout out to Greed. Big shout out to No. A big shout out to Emilia. A big shout out to Nori. A big shout out to Helly. A big shout out to Fawa. You are very beautiful. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Lee and Veronica. A big shout out to Nomi Hela. A big shout out to Tio. Guys, let's go like and subscribe. Clock it. A big shout out to Lily. A big shout out to... Your hair is beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Big shout out to Oha. Guys, let's take 10 seconds, please, to like and subscribe. Yeah, so just give me 10 seconds as well. Yeah, just seconds. Yeah, just seconds. I'll be back. A big shout out to say Yes. Remember, I want to check something. He said I should go back. Moment. Wait. Remove it. Yeah, guys, let's go. Yeah, I'm back. Sorry for that. A big shout out to CBT. A big shout out to Dabadi Balu. A big shout out to Whitney. A big shout out to Daro. A big shout out to Tatiana. A big shout out to Victor. Veronica from Ghana. Hi, my sister. A big shout out to Dabadi Balu. A big shout out to Debbie. A big shout out to Jaroslava. A big shout out to why you look the a big shout out to Theo. Guys, please let's drop our names. I give you a big shout out. Shout out to Gerard. A big shout out to Deborah. Mensoma. A big shout out to Jai Faye. A big shout out to Oli. A big shout out to Jai Faye. Guys, I've said it and I want to say it again. Please stop saying, why are you ignoring me? I don't like it. I think so far that's the worst comment. I don't like it. I said it severally that if I did not see your comment, keep putting it out there. I will see it. Please. I don't like it. It makes me feel like I'm acting unfair to you and I don't want to. So if I did not see your comments, please keep putting it out there. I will say it. Okay. A big shout out to Stephanie. I'm trying my best to see everyone's comment. And if I didn't see it, push it. A big shout out to Eva. A big shout out to Maisha. A big shout out to Stephanie. A big shout out to Theo. A big shout out to Laya. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Fukup. A big shout out, your name is Pregnant. A big shout out to Pregnant. A big shout out to Claire. A big shout out to May. Okay, may I know where you're from? And I will sub. Okay, if I not tell you where I'm from, and probably you don't like where I'm from, or I don't know. The person said, tell me where you're from, I will sub. Like, sorry, I don't get it. Don't follow me based on where I come from or anything. It is what you like. Do you like what I'm doing? Do you like my fashion arc content? If you like it, then you sub. So saying what's the name of your country, then I'll sub. I don't get it. I will answer you. A big shout out to Astriasa. A big shout out to Lily. No, that's not fair. That's not fair. We need to be guided when we talk. A big shout out to Cassie. Hi, you cute. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Shebby. A big shout out to Astrasia. Okay, that's fine. A big shout out to Lucy. A big shout out to Ima. A big shout out to Laura. A big shout out to Mila. I'm from Nigeria. Yes, I am. I'm from Nigeria. Thank you. A big shout out to Lucy. A big shout out to Elliot. I love your hair. Thank you so much. A big shout out to Millie. A big shout out to Chihuahua. Okay, my dog is Chihuahua. Oh, I love Chihuahua's dog a lot because they are little. A big shout out to Dallas. I support. Thank you so much, Maya. A big shout out to Raigan. A big shout out to Sophia. A big shout out to Soma. Where have you been? A big shout out to Millie. Yeah, I love Chihuahua dog. I think for me, I think they're my number one. I just like how little they are. Yeah, that's all. I love puppies, small, just little dogs, small dogs. Because I used to have big dogs. And yeah, I want to try another thing. A big shout out to Scarlett. A big shout out to I love you. I hope you become a big YouTuber. Yeah, pray for me. Pray for me. I know it's not easy, but it is easy. Yeah, with